In this presentation, I'm going to give some examples of how you can apply concepts of Karl Marx's political and economic theories to interpreting Great Expectations. And you remember that I posted a complete version of the PowerPoint lecture on Karl Marx on our website with lecture notes for each slide, and you should be sure that you've read that lecture before you look at this presentation. I'm going to use some slides from that lecture and just touch on the highlights of Marx's concepts before I apply them to a reading of Great Expectations. So if you want more details about anything that I'm going to say about Marx's concepts in this presentation, you need to go look at the lecture slides and the lecture notes that are in that PDF file posted on our website. Now, you remember with Marxist literary criticism that Marxist criticism focuses on literature as an expression of the class conflicts and the resulting ideological conflicts that are prominent in the society in which the author created the piece of literature. All Marxist literary theories look at literature as a product of a particular society at a particular moment in history. So they look at literature as an expression of the particular socioeconomic conditions of that historical time period whenever the piece of literature was produced. And remember that all Marxist literary theories are also based on Marx's political economic philosophy of dialectical materialism. One of the most important points to remember about Marx's philosophy of dialectical materialism is that it argues that historical change is an economic process. Marx saw the foundation of any society as residing in its economy, and he argued that therefore when the economy of a society changes, the entire social structure changes and the ideas of the people who live in that social structure change. And so he argued that the entire history of humanity was a matter of economic changes or class struggles between various classes within a society over which class controlled the primary means of production within that society. And by means of production, he meant the primary techniques by which that society, people in that society, would make their living or would produce the necessities of life. And whenever one class would take over control of production and the economy would change, the entire social structure and the entire ideology or central belief systems of that society would change. In the other selection we read by Marx, he gives a more formal definition of the structure of society using four primary terms: base, mode of production, superstructure, and ideology. And remember that he sees the base or the foundation of any society as residing in its economy, its primary mode of production, which consists of the forces of production or the primary techniques by which the people in that society create the necessities of life, and the social relations of production. The social relationships are class hierarchies that develop out of those forces of production. So the real foundation of society's base is its economy, and out of that base arises what he refers to as the superstructure, or the structure of laws, religious codes, philosophies, and the arts that give order to a society and that express its ideology or its central belief system. Now, by ideology, it's important to understand that Marx uses that term in a more specific way than we tend to use it today. He's referring to, by ideology, he's referring to the belief system of the dominant class in a society, the class that is in control of the mode of production of that society. And he uses the term ideology to indicate a society's consciousness of itself as determined by that dominant class. And to some degree, he uses the term to refer to a sense of false consciousness. Ideology for Marx is a set of illusions or a set of false beliefs fostered by the dominant class in that society, the class that controls the mode of production, in order to ensure social stability, ensure the status quo, and ensure that class's dominance. So that class develops a set of beliefs or a set of illusions that it then foists onto all the other classes within that society. And whereas that ideology reflects the interests of that particular dominant class, the dominant class tries to depict its ideology or its belief system as universal and eternal, and to pass it off to all the other classes within that culture as absolute truth, so that that ideology will support the continued power of that dominant class. So ideology in Marx's idea, or in Marx's view, becomes a political tool of maintaining the power of the dominant class within a society. So let's give an example. Go back to the example of Victorian England. And you remember in the historical background that we covered about Victorian England at the beginning of the semester, we noted that the bourgeoisie or the middle classes became the dominant class in society, and they developed a particular ideological system, or a particular system of beliefs that then became dominant in that culture because they were the most powerful class within that culture. And remember, there were certain features of bourgeois or middle class ideology that became very powerful and prominent in Victorian thinking, including the idea of respectability, the notion of a very strict moral code, sexual repression, the valorization of domesticity as an ideal, and then finally the emphasis on materialism and material wealth as a means, a standard of value, of judging the value of a human being by that person's material possessions. All of those were features of bourgeois ideology or middle class ideology that became the most powerful ideology in Victorian England because the bourgeoisie was the most powerful class. Now, not by any means did all the classes in Victorian society subscribe to all aspects of that ideology. But it was the most powerful ideology because it was the ideology that was promoted by the most powerful class, the middle class, or the bourgeoisie. You might have other classes, like the lower classes, not fully embrace all aspects of middle class ideology. For instance, the very strict moral code and sexual repression of the age would not, or the ideal of domesticity would not have been fully embraced by all aspects of the lower classes. For instance, whereas the middle classes didn't approve of sex outside of marriage, or extramarital sexual activity, it was really common for people from the lower classes to cohabitate before marriage, or to not marry until there was a pregnancy. Or whereas the middle classes might have seen the concept of domesticity and a wife staying at home and taking care of the home while the husband went out and worked in the industrial world as the ideal family structure. For the lower classes, many lower class people couldn't afford to live that way. Working class women had to go out and work in order for their families to survive. They had to work outside of the home. So not everyone would follow the dominant ideology within a culture, and often there would be conflicting ideologies that would develop, and this would lead to ideological conflicts that would therefore come out within the art or within the literature of that society. And so what Marx would argue in applying this notion of ideology to the study of literature is that a piece of literature, because it is a product of the superstructure of a society, through which the society expresses its ideology, literature would therefore inevitably, to some degree, reflect the ideological conflicts between the various classes within a society, and it would inevitably, to some degree, reflect the dominant ideology, that false consciousness that's set up by the dominant class in order for that class to maintain its power in society. Apply these theories to a reading of Great Expectations, we need to think about how the novel reflects the dominant ideology of Charles Dickens' time, of Victorian culture, bourgeois ideology, or the central belief system of the middle classes. And we can see that from the very beginning, when we consider how even lower class characters like Mrs. Joe and Uncle Pumblechook embrace aspects of middle class ideology. Remember that Marx argued that ideology was primarily of a sense of false consciousness, that the dominant class would create a set of beliefs that they would pass off to other classes within that culture as absolute truth. And whereas not all classes might accept that, many people would accept the aspects of the dominant ideology as absolute truth. And Mrs. Joe and Uncle Pumblechook seemed to do that to some degree at the beginning of the novel. And I wanted to read to you an example from the novel that can show you the pervasive impact of middle class ideology in Victorian thinking, even for lower class people. The scene early in the novel when Mrs. Joe is first introduced, and this is in chapter 4 of the novel, pages 40 through 41 in our edition of the novel, the Bedford St. Martin's edition. And this scene introduces Mrs. Joe, and as we read this scene, I want you to think about how Mrs. Joe's thinking about her own material conditions and her own economic position and her own status as a working class woman influences the way she thinks about life and the way she treats other people, especially the way she treats Pip and her husband Joe, the blacksmith. This is on page 40. When we first see Mrs. Joe, Pip has been out to the graveyard to visit the grave of his parents, and there he encountered the convict Magwitch and was frightened by him, and he stole food to give to Magwitch on Christmas Day. And it's important to remember that this is occurring on Christmas, because we tend to associate Christmas with celebration of family connections and celebration of spiritual values, and you'll see that Mrs. Joe instead has embraced the very materialistic values that are associated with the Victorian middle classes, even though she is a lower class or a working class woman herself. She says, or Pip says on page 40, when he shows back up at the house after having been to give the food secretly to Magwitch in the graveyard, he tells a lie to Mrs. Joe about where he's been. She asks him, "Where have you been?" And he says, "I said I've been down to hear the carols." "Ah, well," observed Mrs. Joe, "you might have done worse." "There's no doubt of that, I thought," thinks Pip. "Perhaps if I weren't a blacksmith's wife, and what's the same thing, a slave, with her apron never off, I should have been to hear the carols," said Mrs. Joe. "I'm rather partial to carols myself, and that's the best of reasons for my never hearing any." Okay, now that statement is very revealing about her attitudes towards her own class. What she has done is she has internalized the negative attitudes of the Victorian bourgeoisie or the Victorian middle classes towards the lower classes. She's ashamed of her lower class status. She sees herself, because she's a blacksmith's wife, even though she lives a comfortable life with Joe, he makes plenty of money for them to have good shelter and food, she still sees her status as a blacksmith's wife as something that's derogatory, and compares herself to a slave. And this is going to, the fact that she's embraced these negative attitudes, the middle classes, towards her own status, is going to affect the way that she then treats Joe and Pip. Joe comes into the kitchen, and look at what happens next. Joe, who had ventured into the kitchen after me, as the dustpan had retired before us, drew the back of his hand across his nose with a conciliatory air when Mrs. Joe darted a look at him, and when her eyes were withdrawn, secretly crossed his two forefingers and exhibited them to me as our token that Mrs. Joe was in a cross temper. So she takes out her anger about her lower class status on Joe and Pip, and Pip goes on to say that being in a cross temper was something that was common to her. It was her normal state. Now pay attention to the way she's preparing for the Christmas holidays, and think about in this description how she is trying to mimic bourgeois or middle class values and emphasis on material possessions as a symbol of status. We were to have a superb dinner, Pip says, consisting of a leg of pickled pork and greens and a pair of roast stuffed fowls. A handsome mincemeat pie had been made yesterday morning, which accounted for the mincemeat not being missed, and the pudding was already on the boil. These extensive arrangements occasioned us to be cut off unceremoniously in respect of breakfast. "For I ain't," said Mrs. Joe, "I ain't a-going to have no formal cramming and bussing and washing up now with what I've got before me, I can promise you." So we had our slices served out as if we were 2,000 troops on a forced march instead of a man and boy at home, and we took gulps of milk and water with apologetic countenances from a jug on the dresser. In the meantime, Mrs. Joe put clean white curtains up, and tacked a new flowered flounce across the wide chimney to replace the old one, and uncovered the little state parlor across the passage, which was never uncovered at any other time, but passed the rest of the year in a cool haze of silver paper, which even extended to the 4 little white crockery poodles on the mantel-shelf, each with a black nose and a basket of flowers in his mouth, and each the counterpart of the other. Now, do you see what Mrs. Joe is doing? She is mimicking a lot of the standards and behaviors of the upper middle classes in terms of their display of material wealth as a symbol of their status, especially with the creation of a little separate state parlor for state occasions and for special occasions in her home. It was really common in upper middle class homes for the families to have 2 separate parlors. One was a parlor where the family would meet together in the evenings, and that was the parlor for ordinary everyday life. And then they would have a separate room that was elaborately decorated that they would open up whenever guests came to visit. And so Mrs. Joe has actually set up a separate room in her working class home where she can entertain guests on special occasions like Christmas Day, and that room remains closed up throughout the year and is kept pristine and clean, and is only opened up for these special occasions where she has all of these little decorative items like the little crockery poodles on the mantel shelf to try to give some semblance of wealth or status in her life to her visitors when they come to visit. Now next, Pip is going to make a comment too on how her obsession with material possessions and with her status influences her religious beliefs as well. Mrs. Joe, he says, was a very clean housekeeper, but had an exquisite art of making her cleanliness more uncomfortable and unacceptable than dirt itself. Cleanliness is next to godliness, and some people do the same by their religion. My sister, having so much to do, was going to church vicariously. That is to say, Joe and I were going, so she's forcing them to go to church on Christmas. Now, notice how what's happening here is that Dickens is implying that Mrs. Joe's material conditions and her resulting ideology, or her thinking about her material conditions, which she's embraced from the false ideology created by the middle classes, has influenced her religious beliefs. And remember that Marx argued that religious beliefs also, in addition to philosophical ideas and legal systems, religious beliefs result from the material conditions of a culture, and her religious beliefs are influenced by the material conditions in which she lives. She has embraced that middle class strict moralism, the idea that poverty is a punishment from God for leading an immoral life, which allowed the middle classes to see themselves as somehow morally favored by God and morally better than the lower classes. And she is inflicting this on the lower class people who live with her, Joe and Pip. She's forcing them to go to church, and she's basically punishing them for being lower class. And you can see this in the description of Joe preparing to go to church. In his working clothes, Pip says, Joe was a well-knit, characteristic-looking blacksmith. In his holiday clothes, he was more like a scarecrow in good circumstances than anything else. Nothing that he wore then fitted him or seemed to belong to him, and everything that he wore then graced him. On the present festive occasion, he emerged from his room when the blithe bells were going, the picture of misery in a full suit of Sunday penitentials. So his Sunday suit is like being put in a prison suit, and Mrs. Joe is forcing him to mimic the upper middle classes by dressing up and trying to show again use material possessions as a symbol of your status to show that they have some kind of status. She's trying to ape the upper middle classes. And Joe is being punished for this. As to me, I think my sister must have had some general idea that I was a young offender whom an Uncle Shore policeman had taken up on my birthday and delivered over to her to be dealt with according to the outraged majesty of the law. I was always treated as if I had insisted on being born in opposition to the dictates of reason, religion, and morality, and against the dissuading arguments of my best friends. Even when I was taken to have a new suit of clothes, the tailor had orders to make them like a kind of reformatory, and on no account to let me have free use of my limbs. So what's happening here is that Mrs. Joe has embraced that negative ideology of the middle classes, that lower class poverty or lower class status is some kind of moral punishment from God, and she is inflicting that on poor Pip and Joe. And then you can see the second point on the screen is how Pip's own consciousness is altered by the changes in his material conditions. You can see how Pip eventually begins to embrace the false consciousness of middle class materialism, especially after he encounters that privileged environment, that wealthy environment in which Miss Havisham and Estella live. And as a result, his consciousness is thinking about himself, and his own status is altered. He begins to think badly about his own status, just like Mrs. Joe does, as a result of the upper middle class attitudes that are given to him by Miss Havisham and Estella. And to see an example of that, you can jump to the chapter in which Pip first meets Miss Havisham and Estella labels Pip a common laboring boy, and he begins to feel ashamed about himself because he's internalized the negative attitudes or the judgmental attitudes of the upper middle classes towards the lower classes in Victorian England. And this is on page 77 in chapter 8 of our textbook. Pip has first met Estella and Miss Havisham. He's witnessed the wealth in which they live, the beauty of Estella, and she has called him a common laboring boy and made fun of him whenever they played cards for not knowing how to describe the cards in an upper class or refined manner, for having common laboring hands and dirty boots. And so at the end of this meeting, he goes away from Sada's house ashamed, and this is the bottom of page 77. She laughed contemptuously. Estella laughed at him, pushed me out, and locked the gate upon me. I went straight to Mr. Pumblechook's and was immensely relieved to find him not at home. So, leaving word with the shopman on what day I was wanted at Miss Havisham's again, I set off on the 4-mile walk to our forge, pondering as I went along on all I had seen, and deeply revolving that I was a common laboring boy, that my hands were coarse, that my boots were thick, that I had fallen into a despicable habit of calling knaves jacks, and that I was much more ignorant than I had considered myself last night, and generally that I was in a low-lived, bad way. So what he's done here is he has heard these ideas coming from the upper middle class characters of Miss Havisham and Estella, and has internalized them and applied them to himself. He has internalized bourgeois middle class judgmental values about the lower class, the bourgeois idea that poverty was in some way criminal, and that a human was of lesser value if they were poor, and he's applying that to himself. So he's beginning to be corrupted by the ideology, the upper middle class ideology that he has encountered in Miss Havisham's and Estella's world. And you can see the corrupting power of this ideology in what happens next in this chapter. When he goes home and meets Mrs. Joe, and Mrs. Joe and Uncle Pumblechook ask him about what happened at Miss Havisham, he tells astounding lies about what he encounters there. He exaggerates incredibly the amount of wealth, the amount of display that Miss Havisham engaged in. And these lies, I think, in these lies, he's parroting the materialistic adult's own great expectations. He's playing into the bourgeois fantasies of Mrs. Joe and Uncle Pumblechook because they've embraced bourgeois greed and materialism, and he's playing into their greed. And in line, he's showing us how corrupting the power of this false consciousness of Victorian bourgeois materialism is. Take a look on page 79 in this same chapter, when he tells his lies and the consequences. Uncle Pumblechook questions Pip about what he encountered at Miss Havisham's house. He says, "Now, boy, what was she a-doing of when you went in today?" "What was Miss Havisham doing?" asked Mr. Pumblechook. "She was sitting," I answered, "in a black velvet coach." Mr. Pumblechook and Mrs. Joe stared at one another as well they might, and both repeated, "In a black velvet coach." "Yes," said I, "and Miss Estella, that's her niece, I think, handed her in cake and wine at the coach window on a gold plate, and we all had cake and wine on gold plates, and I got up behind the coach to eat mine because she told me to." "Was anybody else there?" asked Mr. Pumblechook. "4 dogs," said I, and of course Miss Havisham didn't have any dogs. "Large or small?" "Immense," said I, "and they fought for veal cutlets out of a silver basket." And his descriptions and his lies just keep getting more and more exaggerated. He keeps embellishing more and more, playing into the materialistic expectations of Mrs. Joe and Uncle Pumblechook. And then he begins to feel bad and begin to feel guilty because he sees that Joe also believes these lies that he's telling. This is on page 81. Now, when I saw Joe open his blue eyes and roll them all round the kitchen in helpless amazement, I was overtaken by penitence, but only as regarded him, not in the least as regarded the other two. Towards Joe and Joe only, because Joe is someone who has never embraced those materialistic values of the upper middle class. He's been very content with his lower class status. Towards Joe and Joe only I considered myself a young monster, while they sat debating what results would come to me from Miss Havisham's acquaintance and favor. They had no doubt that Miss Havisham would do something for me. Their doubts related to the form that something would take. My sister stood out for property, so Mrs. Joe thinks that Miss Havisham might reward Pip by leaving him some property or some money. Mr. Pumblechook was in favor of a handsome premium for binding me apprentice to some genteel trade, say the corn and seed trade, for instance, because that's the trade in which Mr. Pumblechook is. And so he hopes that Miss Havisham will give some money to pay the premium to make Pip an apprentice to Uncle Pumblechook so that he can get that money. So in other words, the only things that Mrs. Joe and Uncle Pumblechook are interested in about Pip's experience with Miss Havisham is what material wealth they will get out of this event. Joe fell into the deepest disgrace with both for offering the bright suggestion that I might only be presented with one of the dogs who had fought for the veal cutlets, and it's because Joe's not really interested in the material things that could come out of the meeting with Miss Havisham. And so Pip goes on to tell Joe, because he feels guilty about deceiving him, that everything he told them about the visit to Miss Havisham was a lie. He says, "It's a terrible thing, Joe. It ain't true." "What are you telling of, Pip?" cried Joe, falling back in the greatest amazement. "You don't mean to say it's—" "Yes, I do. It's lies, Joe." "But not all of it? Why, sure you don't mean to say, Pip, that there were no black velvet coach, eh?" For I stood shaking my head. "But there was dogs, Pip." "Come, Pip," said Joe persuasively. "If there weren't no veal cutlets, at least there was dogs." "No, Joe." "A dog?" said Joe. "A puppy? Come." "No, Joe, there was nothing of the kind." As I fixed my eyes hopelessly on Joe, Joe contemplated me in dismay. "Pip, old chap, this won't do, old fellow, I say. Where do you expect to go to?" "It's terrible, Joe, ain't it?" "Terrible?" cried Joe. "Awful! What possessed you?" "I don't know what possessed me, Joe," I replied, letting his shirt sleeve go and sitting down in the ashes at his feet, hanging my head. "But I wish you hadn't taught me to call knaves at cards jacks, and I wish my boots weren't so thick nor my hands so coarse." And then I told Joe that I felt very miserable and that I hadn't been able to explain myself to Mrs. Joe and Pumblechook, who were so rude to me, and that there had been a beautiful young lady at Miss Havisham's who was so dreadfully proud, and that she had said I was common, and that I knew I was common, and that I wished I was not common, and that the lies had come of it somehow, though I didn't know how. Now, what's happening here is that Pip has begun to embrace the false consciousness, as Marx would define it, of the Victorian middle classes, that because you have coarse boots or coarse hands, that you are somehow of lesser value, even though he knows it's a lie. He knows it's not true. And yet that false consciousness, those false values, or that false ideology is so powerful from his experience of the material conditions of the world of Miss Havisham and Estella, that it begins to overwhelm him and influence his own consciousness, his thinking about himself and his self-image. And Joe tells him, you can't believe that way. It's a lie. You can't believe that way. He tells him, there's one thing you may be sure of, Pip, said Joe after some rumination, namely, that lies is lies. Howsomever they come, they didn't ought to come. And they come from the father of lies, and work round to the same. Don't you tell no more of 'em, Pip. That ain't the way to get out of being common, old chap. Okay, so that's not the way to advance in society, by embracing that false consciousness or those false values. But unfortunately, Pip cannot escape from those values. If you look at the end of this chapter, he makes one of the most important statements, one of the best examples of how the false consciousness or the false ideology of the Victorian upper middle classes has influenced the way that he thinks about himself and his life. 83, the very end of chapter 9, even though he goes up to his bed after talking to Joe about how he's lied and feeling guilty about his lies, he goes up to his bed to say his nighttime prayers and ask for forgiveness from God. He still can't get away from that false consciousness that he has encountered. He says at the bottom of page 85, and these are the last two paragraphs of chapter 9, when I got up to my little room and said my prayers, I did not forget Joe's recommendation that I ask for forgiveness for having lied. And yet my young mind was in that disturbed and unthankful state that I thought long after I laid me down how common Estella would consider Joe, a mere blacksmith, how thick his boots, and how coarse his hands. And of course those are all judgments from that false consciousness of Victorian middle class ideology, Victorian materialism, that sees the lower classes as of lesser value as human beings. I thought how Joe and my sister were then sitting in the kitchen, and how I had come up to bed from the kitchen, and how Miss Havisham and Estella never sat in the kitchen, but were far above the level of such common doings. Now notice how he's even repeating their words, common, 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 the words that embody their upper middle class ideology. I fell asleep recalling what I used to do when I was at Miss Havisham's, as though I had been there weeks or months instead of hours, as though it were quite an old subject of remembrance instead of one that had arisen only that day. That was a memorable day to me, for it made great changes in me. Now remember how Marx argued that consciousness, the way we think about our life, is determined by the material conditions in which we live. Pip is showing this to us, that a great change in his consciousness has been wrought by the change in material conditions that he's encountered. But it is the same with any life. Imagine one selected day struck out of it, and think how different its course would have been. Pause, you who read this, and think for a moment of the long chain of iron or gold, of thorn or flowers, that would never have bound you but for the formation of the first link on one memorable day. So in other words, we see the impact of class conflict, of the ideology of the middle classes and looking down on the lower classes, on Pip's self-image, on his consciousness, and on his whole future life being established in that event where he went to Miss Havisham and witnessed a different material world, people living in a different class than himself, and had their false consciousness pushed onto himself to the point that it begins to corrupt him. And so ultimately, when he is given great expectations of advancement himself, of offered the opportunity of being able to ascend into the upper middle classes through gaining wealth and status. He fully embraces those false ideals and is fully corrupted by them, so that he turns away from Joe completely, and we see him already beginning to turn away from Joe after the first meeting with Miss Havisham, as he begins to think that Joe is coarse and common. And he rejects Joe. He rejects all his humane values, and embraces Victorian materialism wholly. And it's going to be the learning process of Pip in the latter half of the novel to try to recognize the falseness of that ideology that's promoted by the upper middle classes, that sees material wealth as the primary standard of judging the value of people. And instead, he has to recognize that people need to be valued by their inner character. And it becomes a terrible and difficult learning process for him that he only comes to by finally recognizing that his entire expectations are false. His money doesn't come from the upper middle class, Miss Havisham. His money is not set aside in order for him to be able to marry the girl of his dreams, Estella. Instead, it comes from the lower class convict Magwitch. And whereas initially Pip is horrified by that, and he despises the lower class convict because he is coarse and common, he eventually comes to love Magwitch and to reject his money. He decides, even before he helps Magwitch to escape from England, that he's not going to take the money, and instead he uses what little bit of the money that he keeps to buy a partnership for his best friend Herbert in a business that will allow him to be able to settle down and marry the girl he loves. And Pip gets rid of the rest of the money, refuses to take it, and instead tries to help Magwitch to escape from England, as a demonstration of his newfound humanitarian values and his rejection of Victorian materialism. So he recovers from the corrupting nature of the false consciousness of Victorian bourgeois values by the end of the novel to some degree. But here's where we get to the last point that you see on the screen. The conclusion of the novel. Marxist critics have deep problems with the way Dickens concludes his novels, because he always has his heroes ascend into the bourgeoisie, into the middle class, and end their lives in comfort and in relative wealth. And many Marxist critics feel that for a novel like Great Expectations, that is so deeply critical of the dehumanizing effects of bourgeois values and Victorian materialism, that for Dickens to allow Pip to ascend into the bourgeoisie at the end of the novel is a contradiction of that powerful social criticism. Pip becomes a self-satisfied capitalist at the end of the novel. What these critics argue is that Pip ascends into the very class that was responsible for the false consciousness that had corrupted him from the beginning of the novel. So let's end. You need to think if you agree with this assessment by Marxist critics or not. And let's end by looking at a passage from the end of the novel, from chapter 58 on page 435, that can give an example of this, where they feel that Dickens is contradicting himself and contradicting his own social criticism in allowing Pip to, even though he was supposed to have turned his back on bourgeois materialism, that he seems to some degree still embrace those materialistic values that he is supposed to have recovered from in his moral evolution in the novel. At the end of chapter 58 on page 435 in the Bedford St. Martin's edition of the text, Pip tells us that after Magwitch died, and after he refused to take Magwitch's Great Expectations or his inheritance from him, and he recovered from a terrible illness, he sold all that he had so that he could go away to join Herbert in his company in Egypt. He says, I sold all I had and put aside as much as I could for a composition with my creditors, who gave me ample time to pay them in full, and I went out and joined Herbert in Egypt, where they have a branch of their company. Within a month I had quitted England, and with 2 months I was clerk to Clarriker and Company, and within 4 months I assumed my first undivided responsibility, because the father of Herbert's fiancée dies, and Herbert is able to marry her. So Herbert had gone away to marry Clara, and I was left in sole charge of the eastern branch of their company until he brought her back to Egypt. Many a year went round before I was a partner in the house. So eventually he rises to become a partner in this company. And remember that he used the little bit of Magwitch's money to purchase a partnership for Herbert secretly in this company. But I lived happily with Herbert and his wife, and lived frugally, and paid my debts, and maintained a constant correspondence with Biddy and Joe. Now it's interesting that this final passage constantly moves back and forth from Pip's pride in his material advancement, in becoming a success and a partner and making money in this firm, and his reaffirmation of human connections and spiritual values rather than material values, in reestablishing his friendship with Joe and with Biddy, and keeping his friendship going with Herbert. So it's like it's a combination of the two conflicting value systems in the novel, materialism versus the spiritual value of humanity. And then he says that they finally revealed to Herbert that he had purchased himself the partnership for Herbert in the company. And Herbert was as much moved and amazed, and the dear fellow and I were not the worse friends for the long concealment. I must not leave it to be supposed that we were ever a great house, so we never grew to be an incredibly wealthy company, or that we made mince of money. We were not in a grand way of business, but we had a good name, and worked for our profits, and did very well. So he ends the novel a very self-satisfied capitalist, also participating in the imperialist capitalist endeavors of Britain abroad, because Egypt was an area where Britain was trying to create the Suez Canal at the time the novel is set, so that they could have contact with their major colony in India. So he's part of that capitalist system that exploited other countries for the materialistic benefit of Great Britain. And that also bothers a lot of Marxist critics at the end of the novel. He becomes part of the exploitative system that had exploited him from the beginning of the novel. So do you find that contradictory? Is Pip recovering from the greed promoted by Victorian materialism enough? Or is Dickens to some degree undermining Pip's moral reformation by allowing him to ascend into the bourgeoisie that had corrupted him in the first place? Is Dickens implying that Pip's material advancement at the end of the novel and his capitalist success is some kind of a spiritual or moral reward for his moral reformation? How can you receive a material reward for your spiritual reformation? So is that a contradiction? That's something you're going to have to think about. I'll leave that to you to argue on the discussion board. To what degree is Pip's reformation from the false ideology that Marx would say his culture has pushed onto him convincing, and to what degree is it contradictory? So think about those things for the discussion board assignment number 2 that's coming up at the end of this week. Thanks for listening to this presentation, and if you have any questions about ways in which we could further apply Marxist theories to discussion of Great Expectations, drop me an email. But mainly Marxist theories and application to the study of literature deals with class conflict, and Great Expectations is full of class conflict, and how class conflict leads to ideological conflicts that then play out within the lives of the characters in the novel.